Hey everybody, this was a little video that I made for an organization called Inside Literature. It was kind of a spur of the moment thing, but is what inspired me to get back here onto YouTube. So I figured I'd share it with you guys. It's not really a great YouTube video, but since it's what kind of got me back on here, I figured I'd throw it up here for everyone's enjoyment. If you want to check out Inside Literature, they're a non-profit organization that teaches literature, obviously, to inmates in the prisons. That's the name, Inside Literature. I'll go ahead and link that in the description. Otherwise, enjoy the video and check out the channel. Hello, my name is Michael. I study history, in particular military history, from the Civil War until World War II. Today I would like to take a look at a particular object, the model of 1917 trench knife, as a way of taking a look at World War I. World War I was an event that occurred between July 28, 1914 and November 11, 1918, spanning a period of 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks. In this time period, 20 million died and 21 million were wounded. Those are pretty big numbers, and we like to talk about this war in big numbers. Approximately 75% of all casualties were caused by artillery. From documents we can show that an estimate of between 2.6 and 2.4 billion rounds were fired from field artillery alone. But these astronomical numbers, I think, actually make it harder to really understand what that means. To get past the static numbers, I'd like to take a close look at this painting, which as far as I can tell is titled Ruski ne Saduskyak, Russians Don't Give Up. This painting depicts what is called the Attack of the Dead Men, which was an action in Poland on August the 6th, 1915. The Germans released chlorine gas on the Russian position at Auschwitz Fortress. This was pretty effective, as Sergei Kremlov, a survivor, recalls. Any living person outside on the bridgehead of the fortress was poisoned to death. The grass turned black. There were flower petals scattered everywhere. Meat, butter, lard, vegetables were poisoned and deemed unsuitable for consumption. Ultimately, however, the Germans could not take advantage of this, as about 60 Russians decided to suicidally charge the Germans, and the Russians actually eventually effected a successful counterpush. Why I'm showing you this painting is because it very clearly captures all the elements that were active in the battles in the European theater. Poison gas, millions of rounds of artillery, rifles, handguns. But look in particular at the Germans in the foreground. On the left we see one defending himself with a spade, and we can see that almost every single one of them has a club attached to them by a lanyard. Although it is true these clubs were created in the trenches, their construction was actually outlined in the manuals given to the soldiers. These manuals also included instructions on how to weaponize shovels by sharpening the edges. This was the kind of warfare the designers of the model of 1917 were preparing for. Originally, early trench knives were handmade or made in the battlefield. Examples include the German Nahkampfmesser close combat knife, which was a 6-inch single-edged steel blade. Another example was the French nail, which were fashioned from barbed wire stakes that were found on the battlefield. Another example was the poignard bayonet, or dagger bayonet, which was made from cut-down Lebel M1886 rifle bayonets. And eventually the French would develop what they called the Cateau Poignard Model 1916, popularly known as the Avenger, which would sort of come to be the measure by which all other trench knives would be measured. When the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, entered the trenches, its troops carried the M1917 trench knife, based on the Model 1916, but with a triangular blade. I think it's easy to take a look at this model 1917 trench knife and immediately see it was invented with one specific purpose: It is a pointy piece of metal. But isn't that really what any knife is? There's a school of thought that these knives grew out of the ungainliness of the existing bayonets. Referred to as a general group as sword bayonets, typically examples like the British pattern 1907 and the American model 1917 bayonet had an overall length of just over 21 inches. Not exactly convenient. But there wasn't an overall push to shorten bayonets until World War II. In original trials, one of the specific criteria the US military had for the model of 1917 was it needed to penetrate very well. They were particularly worried about the winter overcoats worn by German soldiers. This object was designed for one particular purpose. The idea was to plunge this spike into the body of the enemy, straight into the heart, thus silencing the target before they were able to notify the rest of the soldiers in their trench. The squads of men sent on raids were vastly outnumbered and outgunned when they reached the opposing trenches. It was their goal to grab prisoners for interrogation back in their own line. This constant threat of nighttime terror wasn't just a way to gather actual information. In fact, most sources seem to suggest this kind of random snatch and grab didn't really accomplish much, but it created a constant sense of fear. Unfortunately, it generally also created a sense of uncertainty in the men who had to conduct these raids as well. Americans would not start dying in official action until November of 1917. The war started in July of 1914. Unlike the French, though, who had had to innovate things like the French nail out of things found on the battlefield, the American forces had the advantage of entering the war with a little over 3 years of being able to watch what everyone else did. In early December 1917, American Expeditionary Forces Commander General John Pershing warned the Secretary of War that the collapse of the Russian front, the Germans would be able to concentrate on the Western Front in the spring. The Russian Revolution is generally cited as beginning in March 8, 1917, and it is generally seen as the reason for this. It was expected the Germans would field 260 divisions, and the Allies could only muster about 169. Pershing judged that it was, quote, very doubtful that the Allies could stop the Germans, given the disparity in manpower. A major issue in this was the mismanagement of American mobilization. Preparing for war was a monumental challenge, characterized by so much inefficiency and corruption that Secretary of War Newton Baker actually offered to resign. Despite having been technically at war since April, the United States had just 4 infantry divisions in France, and they were all short on training, equipment, and modern staff techniques. The Army had not even developed contingency plans for putting together a large force for the participation in World War I, having been forbidden to do so by President Woodrow Wilson and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, both visionaries who believed a nation could remain aloof from war by simply refusing to prepare for it. Pershing estimated that the United States would need at least 24 divisions on the Western Front by June for the Allies to have any chance of stopping the expected German attack. One solution offered by the European powers was known as amalgamation, and that would have United States insert its men directly into existing British and French units at the company level. Europeans argued that amalgamation would compensate for the inexperience of American officers and NCOs, as well as the American lack of familiarity with modern staff arrangements and technologies like aviation, armor, and heavy artillery. Especially Woodrow Wilson and General Pershing were staunchly against the idea. Wilson therefore gave Pershing a written order before his departure to Europe, forbidding him from amalgamating American forces. Pershing stubbornly held to this position that American forces would only fight under a completely American chain of command, on distinctly American section of the Western Front. At one point, he even told French Premier Georges Clemenceau that he was prepared to see the Allied forces pushed back to the Lorne River, meaning the loss of Paris, rather than amalgamate into the larger European units. Pershing contended that the Europeans had become tied to trench warfare. He argued for his, what he called, open warfare doctrine. He wanted to focus on mobility and emphasize American aggressiveness and marksmanship. Wilson recognized that an amalgamated American force would not allow for a distinctive American presence on the Western Front, and this would undermine American interest in any post-war peace conference. Many average Americans rightly looked at the numbers of dead and injured so far in the European powers and also questioned amalgamation. This allowed Wilson and Pershing's perspective to further guide future decisions. Ultimately, the topic of amalgamation was decided mid-December 1917 in a decision that read in part, "The President agrees to the American forces being, if necessary, amalgamated with the French and British units as small on units as small as the company." But something else, somewhat more subtle, was also in Wilson's mind at the moment. Wilson did not just want to be at the peace table when the war was over, he wanted to dictate the terms. He saw a clear connection between American lives sacrificed in actual combat and political clout. On this topic himself, Wilson stated, "Our terms of peace will probably run counter to most of the European proposals, and our weight in the accomplishment of our ideals will be greatly in proportion to the strength with which we have thrown into the scale." Wilson's dedication to this idea would drive his aggressive stance, and Pershing was also a vocal proponent. He said, "We must look forward to bearing a very heavy part in this conflict before it ends. Our position will be stronger if our army, acting as such, shall have played a distinct and definite part." The looming problem, however, wasn't lessening by any of this. U.S. forces were still laughably unprepared. The regular army in April of 1917 only numbered 133,000 men and 5,800 officers. The National Guard consisted of 67,000 men and 3,200 officers. To put that in perspective, the British Expeditionary Force suffered 60,000 casualties on just the first day of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. To prepare for this, the United States completed one of the most aggressive and successful recruiting campaigns, raising the total number of soldiers to 4 million in just 19 months. Although this problem of raising troops was difficult enough, there were still several other issues. As I said earlier, Pershing professed a doctrine of open warfare, but his vision of doctrine based in fluid movement was decidedly at odds with the reality of the Western Front. More confusing, he and the War Department in practice focused on creating an army whose fundamental capacity lay in inflicting casualties on the Germans in a static, grinding war of attrition. Of the confusion surrounding this open warfare doctrine, Major General Hunter Liggett wrote, "I can find nothing in the mass literature I have received which teaches me this essential question." One main argument for this dichotomy in Pershing's proposed tactics and his actual preparations seems to be tied to this amalgamation issue. Pershing argued uniquely American tactics of open warfare meant his men could not be deployed among other Allied powers. He had to remain insistent that open warfare was the key to success, but in doing so he prevented himself from making an honest assessment of the tactical problem, leaving his commanders confused and unsure on how to train their troops. This has left a lingering question in the minds of historians and contemporary critics. Did this perspective in any way interfere with the preparations Wilson and Pershing were overseeing? It cannot be denied that they had a lot of reason to overlook any shortcomings and champion their viewpoint against any detractors. No one can say how many lives were lost, or really even if lives were lost directly, but it is clear both had a strong incentive to weigh their political gains over American lives. But here's one more fact about World War I to think about. Germany and France sent an estimated 80% of their men between the ages of 15 and 49 into battle. That means in those countries, if you knew 10 men between those ages, 8 of them disappeared from the context of everyday life and lived among those 20 million waiting to die. This was an event that forced literal millions into a horrific experience for over 4 years, and many of those in those two most affected countries had been forced to go. This event defined a global generation, but maybe more powerfully the emotions and experiences of the individuals who lived through it would shape the events of World War II. They would allow the aggression of the Nazis and the complacency of the Allies. One can't help but wonder what lessons this may have for our contemporary parallels.